everyone, it's Sean. In this demonstration, I'm going to be going over blending modes in Photoshop. Blending modes can be one of those things that can be really tricky if you don't quite understand what the modes are doing. So I'm going to break down the different sections of blending modes, and I'm going to show you some examples of what you can do with different types of textures and color overlays and stuff to really enhance your photos and bring in a whole new attitude and aesthetic to things. So to get things off, I'm in Photoshop. I have open a file which I provided you guys in your blending modes folder. It's this Oliver Ragfelt file from Unsplash. So we're just going to go ahead and open that guy up. And then I have a few different textures in here that we're going to be playing around with. So before we start loading in textures and things like that, what I want to do is quickly explain what the blending modes are doing within Photoshop. So the blending modes are listed right up here where it says normal, and there's a few different groups that we can be aware of when we look at this, because the list looks pretty intimidating. So first of all, we have normal and dissolve. These are, your standard ones. I pretty much only stick with normal. And then we have our first group, which is right here. This is the sort of darker colors. All of these blending modes will enhance your darker tones in your images and blend them on top of whatever layers you have them on. The second group from below or from the top is your lightening layers. So they'll accentuate all the lighter tones and colors. They favor white. So just be mindful of that. If you want to accentuate the whites or the lighter colors, you want to go with this group. The third group in the middle here, these are your blended sort of modes, overlay and soft light. They'll sort of mix the light and the dark shades and your colors and, for lack of a better term, overlay them on top of the image that you're going to be working with. And then you have difference, exclusion, add, and subtract. Those are kind of really strange ones. You'll never really, it's very rare that you'll use them. They just have a lot of really weird effects. They're not too worth getting into, so we'll just kind of skip over them. But if you want to play around with them at your own leisure, go for it. And then finally down here, hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. These are blending modes that will only affect the color. So we'll be getting into that as well. So with that explanation, what you can do is you can unlock the background layer, layer 0, just so that we all are on the same page here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in my, we're going to bring in the light leaks texture first. So we can just click and drag that into our Photoshop document. And I'm just going to scale it up and rotate it so that it's vertical instead of horizontal. And I'm just going to have it fill our canvas. So I'm going to unproportionally stretch it out. This is fine because it is just a texture, so it doesn't really matter if you play around with the proportions. Oftentimes, the more abstract the texture, the more forgiving it's going to be. So now we have this light block of colors. We have some darks, we have some highlights, we have some really bold, nice looking colors. And it's time that we sort of try and play around with this so that it can be integrated into our photo here. So what we can do, I'm going to first look at accentuating the lighter colors, the whites and the highlights. And so based off of the explanations that I just gave, we're going to be looking at the lighten sort of section of our blend modes here. And what I'd like to do first is I'd like to apply screen. And what screen does is it eliminates any of the dark hues in favor of all of the light ones. And so now you kind of get this really cool moment where you can play around with things, you can really experiment and have them look their absolute best. So I'm going to reverse the orientation of the texture I just had because it shows so much better from bottom to top. And now you get this really cool sort of vintage like light leak 1970s, 1960s film camera sort of thing going on. And if this effect is too strong for you, we can always adjust the opacity of our effects. Sometimes it's not the best route because it does just dull things as opposed to sort of leaving them nice and vibrant and dealing with them with like a layer mask or something like that. But since I actually just mentioned opacity, I want to take a second to talk about that. So if I go up to normal and just reset our blend mode to normal here, I think a lot of people, when they start learning about blending modes, or when they start thinking about Photoshop and lighting and textures, their initial idea is to apply opacity. So like dull this down to like 50% so you still get some of the colors showing through, and then maybe create a layer mask with a nice wide brush, and then try and like mask out the areas that you don't necessarily want this to be applied to. And you know what? That's not really the greatest method for sort of doing this, because obviously the colors aren't nearly as vibrant. Everything looks a lot duller, and it's just not the look we're going for. So please don't be confused between opacity and the blending modes that we were just looking at, okay? So next up, under Lighten, you'll sort of see that Lighten favors a little bit more of the blacks. It leaves the darker tones, and it sort of masks them over top of other dark tones. This again is also a really cool sort of filter and aesthetic, depending on the application that you're using it for. So, you know, the best thing that you can really do is just play around with all of these different lighting blending modes and lighting techniques and stuff like that. I personally find out of the light section, screen and lighten to be the best, because as you can see, color dodge, linear dodge, and lighter color create very extreme effects, and rarely do these extreme effects sort of actually play out properly in your design. For example, I think, yeah, color dodge looks like a very old Instagram filter from the beginning of Instagram. Not the greatest look. So that's a quick sort of showcase of the lighter color schemes, or the lighter color blending modes rather. I'm just going to open Finder back up, and this time we're going to take dust and film, and we're going to drop it into our file yet again. I'm just going to scale it up so it's nice and large. When my computer decides to cooperate today, there we go. So it's nice and large, doesn't really matter too much. This is a nice high resolution photo, so we don't really have to worry too much about zooming in, but you always want to be mindful of pixelation and stuff. So now when it comes to dust and scratches, you can see we have tons of black again as well. So you could easily just go back under screen, and you can see that we've eliminated all of the black from our image, and we're just blending in the highlights, right? And so you're getting a completely different effect here. And the cool thing is, when you're dealing with sort of like dust, scratchy grunginess, this is where you really can adjust the opacity of these things, because it's such a subtle technique. Adjusting the opacity doesn't really diminish its effect. If anything, it makes it a little bit more believable. This is also an opportunity where you might want to go in and remove any sort of texture that falls on your main subject. My computer is being really slow to catch up, but you can sort of see it eliminating the main dustiness that was on our subject's shirt. So just sort of leaves the rest of the texture in the background sort of elements. Now, if we wanted to, we could do something really cool, and that's invert the colors of our texture. So with this layer selected, what we can do is hit Command-I on the keyboard, and that will automatically invert all of the colors. Here, I'll switch back to normal. That will automatically invert all of the colors of our original texture from those dark blacks and bright white sort of scratches to the opposite. So now it's sort of like creamy whites and dark blacks. And now if you wanted to, you could change the blend mode. We were originally on screen, which isn't really doing a whole lot because the whites aren't blending in since we have a very bright image. We could change it from screen to our darker color schemes here, up here where it says darken, multiply, color burn, and etc. I'm going to choose multiply. And what multiply does is it's going to eliminate all of the white in favor of all of the shadows. And you can see that our scratches still come through. It is a completely different tone and aesthetic, captures an entirely different mood. So just kind of a cool trick to be aware of when you're dealing with blending modes. Sometimes if you're not getting the desired effect, you could just easily invert your layer colors and see what the new blending mode looks like. Because we did this on a smart object, when you apply a filter to this layer, it creates something called a smart filter, and you can easily turn this effect on and off. So it's non-destructive, which is a big principle of what we're trying to learn with Photoshop, and it's still fully controllable, which is awesome. And just like before, we can go in and affect the opacity of it. So now it just looks like sort of a dirty, messy, stepped on sort of like print. And that can be useful depending on the type of project that you're working on, or the type of story you're trying to tell. So that's kind of another really cool sort of place to go as well. Now, the blend modes that I use most frequently probably will be coming in this glass texture here. So if we click and drag it from our project file or from our project folder into Photoshop, and then we can resize it as well. I'm just going to make this vertical and then scale it on up like so. Cool. Using our blend modes, I want to change this from normal, and I want to use these sort of mid blend modes down here, overlay and soft light, the ones that really take into consideration shadows, highlights, and color. And I'm going to apply overlay to this. And what you can see is overlay is retaining the highlights, it's retaining the shadows, but as the image gets lighter and loses saturation, it's sort of masking out the information of our texture and leaving it more as a natural sort of tone. This blend mode overlay is one of the ones that I use most frequently because it provides the most interesting effects. And so you can kind of get this really cool sort of like fantasy style aesthetic coming from this sort of blend mode. Depending on its implementation, you can really get some cool sort of things going on with it. If I switch it over to soft light and overlay are very similar. Overlay is a little bit more intense version of soft light. So depending on how subtle you want your textures to be, you might just want to switch between the two. Hard light is even more harsh than overlay, and you can see that the visual information is sort of coming back into the photo down here, like the pattern. That's because hard light doesn't really deal with the same lighting information that overlay does. Vivid light, even more so. It's basically blowing out anywhere that there's a highlight in or a lighter color in your original texture. Linear light is even more harsh. So sort of the further down you get, the more drastic your effects come into play. Honestly, again, the best thing I can vouch for you guys to do is play around with these blending modes. Whenever you're not sure what to do, just check them all out, see what might work best for you, and eventually you'll start to get your own favorite blending modes that match your style and your editing techniques as well. So now that I've shown you overlay, soft light, and the other color blending modes, I'm going to quickly jump back down to our light leaks layer, and I want to show you guys what the color modes do down here, because they can do some really cool stuff. So right away, hue, what we can sort of see is it's taking the hues from our texture, it is cross-referencing it with the hues in the original image, and it's creating sort of like the difference of hues that are involved in both sort of textures, right? Again, really cool for a sort of aesthetic choice in coloring, very situational, but you might find it useful at some point. Saturation, it's basically working off of the saturation of the colors in the texture and applying them to the original image underneath. Color is actually taking the exact colors from the texture, our light leak, and applying them on top of our image. So if you wanted to colorize something in a very interesting way, something that might be difficult to achieve through gradient, or maybe you're just looking for a really natural, cool lighting condition that's difficult to replicate digitally, you can take your reference imagery, you can take this sort of texture that you're working with, apply color to it, and it will apply color across the photograph wherever there is color in the original texture. So you can see up here that our texture is kind of black, it's a dull black, and so in the applied sort of blending mode, there seems to be an absence of color happening up here. So just sort of something to be aware of. The other cool thing that we can do with blending modes is you can apply levels and curves to help deal with some of the lighting conditions. So in this case, I don't like this sort of dull, gross, grayish black. I want to make that just like solid, like a solid black, like just better, basically. So what I'm doing is I'm going to adjust our levels, and I'm just going to play around and tweak the colors until I get something that maybe is a little bit more vibrant in the interior. I might be able to dull down some of the whites, dull down some of the blacks. That doesn't really look the greatest though. So you really can play around with levels to sort of enhance some of the effects that you're getting from here, which can be really cool. And the other thing too is they continue to apply even when you change blending mode. So I just switched it back up to screen, and what I can do is I can turn off smart filters. By the way, I just realized to get the levels menu that I just had up here, I hit Command L on the keyboard, and it brought up all of my levels. Alternatively, you could have just created a levels adjustment layer from up here. So when we have our levels, we've adjusted them. The really cool thing with smart filters is you can turn them on and off. So this is the original color tones that we applied using screen, and these are the adjusted ones with levels. You just get a little bit more saturation in the blown out sort of section. That could be really nice as well. And again, just carrying on to, you can apply other effects to this. So you can see how it's really grainy and noisy because of the original texture. You can see all of that noise coming through up in there. To eliminate something like that, the great thing is about blend modes is they're very forgiving. So I'm going to apply a Gaussian blur to our light leaks. And what that will do is it'll smooth out all of the noise. It'll kind of eliminate it in a sense. But because our light was so soft and so blended and nice and smooth, it leaves you with this very visually pleasing sort of color palette. And you can tell that just by applying one overlay, like one blending mode, one color sort of from a texture, you've changed the aesthetic of this image completely, and now it serves as a pretty dynamic, visually interesting sort of approach. Maybe if you guys are working with branding projects or things like that and you need to have a very interesting color aesthetic, this might work for you. But again, it's all up to playing around. So like I've been saying, the best thing to do, play around with blending options, play around with the modes. Personally, I've found in terms of blending modes, I use normal, multiply, darken on occasion. I use lighten and screen a lot, overlay and soft light a lot, and then I use color periodically as well. Those seem to be the ones that fit me the best and that work the best into my Photoshop style. But as you guys continue on with this, you'll figure out what works best for you. So that's it for blending modes. I hope you found it useful. We'll be building some composite photos throughout this section of the course, and we'll touch on blending modes a little bit more as we do so. I hope you guys found it useful, and I'll catch you in the next